I once heard Gore Vidal comment in a radio interview that the US in the post-war period was drunk on oil. And this phrase, it spoke to me a lot at the time, but this phrase, somewhat modified, comes to mind now. Australia is drunk on coal. From the employees who suffer horrendous work-life balances in return for the golden handshake that the resource sector rewards them with in the short term, to the mum and dad shareholders whose pension funds are invested in mining companies, to the mining corporations whose grasp on political power in Australia is unprecedented, to the economists who continue to preach the flow-on benefits of resource sector growth, to the climate change sceptics who downplay climate change as forests burn and cities are flooded, to the politicians whose myopia leads them to cancel any responsible action on climate change. We are all drunk on the largesse that coal provides us. Australia rode out the GFC with a resources boom that didn't falter, and any attempt to discuss a post-carbon world is silenced, as we've seen in our recent national elections. So in the face of the coal lobby and all these parties singing from the same sheet, it's instructive to glimpse the failure of market performativity. Under the cover of issuing legitimate market information, the concerns of Earth others that are usually externalised and thus ignored were expressed in a language that could be understood. For a brief moment, the hybrid collective for post-coal livelihoods initiated action that had certain effects. So this story helps me, I think, to begin to talk about and think about collective action differently. So what constitutes collective action? We can identify, I think, many answers to this question in the work of Gibbs and Graham, and I want to review how our thinking on this question evolved and where its potential limits lie. Many of the theoretical interventions that we've made have sprung from a dissatisfaction with the way that political economy re-performs the discursive dominance of capitalism to the detriment of a politics of economic becoming. We proposed that a politics of language had a role to play in any collective action. And our deconstruction of capitalist dominance involved documenting the radical heterogeneity of both capitalist and non-capitalist economic practices that make up our world, and proposing a diverse or more than capitalist economy. The purpose of this inventory was not to lay out a vision of a preferred world, but to explore and to enumerate the vast array of economic practices making up our worlds. And we've used this diverse economy framing or reframing as a step towards opening up the space for different political imaginations. And many of our members of the collective have used this kind of framing to do action research here in the Pioneer Valley. Kevin's used it to work with fishing communities in the northeastern coast of New England. People have used it in the Philippines and Indonesia and elsewhere. In the capitalist economy, or economy as machine imaginary, subjects are confined to a narrow set of roles and motivations. In the field of work, they're subjected to the notion of being an employee who wants, of course, higher and higher wages. In the field of enterprise or business, the subject position is as a business owner who wants more and more profits and lower costs, especially wages costs. When it comes to markets, we're all positioned as consumers who want more stuff for less payout. When it comes to property, we're seen as property owners who want higher and higher returns from private property. And in the field of finance, we're investors who want greater private returns from financial investments. Well, the diverse economy framing allows us to identify multiple subject positions, not just those ones, and multiple motivations that coexist in more than capitalist economies. We can identify economic relations shaped not by the so-called laws of motion of capitalist competition, reproduction and accumulation, but by other, more contingent and ethically invested dynamics. And this figure of the iceberg is something we've often used in action research to talk about where people are situated in multiple spaces within economies and the different kinds of investments they have in those spaces. By listening, observing and interacting with people in action research around rethinking the economy, we've come to see the potential for collective actions to build community economies oriented around key ethical concerns. And this is the version of the iceberg that's been used in the Pacific, where icebergs don't really resonate, but coconuts do. As our work has evolved, so we've codified these coordinates or concerns of community economies. And in the latest rendition in Take Back the Economy, we reframe these coordinates by taking back and reframing work, reframing business, reframing markets, property and finance. So rather than talking about work, we talk about survival, surviving well. How do we survive well together with human and non-human others? What is the work that we do? How can we combine our different kinds of work practices to survive well? How can we form enterprises that distribute surplus to enrich social and environmental health? So the concern here of the community economy is distributing surplus rather than making profits in business. When it comes to transactions, we're interested in engaging in transactions that allow us to encounter others, and in the process of surviving well in a responsible and caring way. How do we encounter others through all the kinds of transactions we're involved in, and how might we do so in a way that supports their well-being as well as ours? When we think about property, we think about the relationships to property that allow us to maintain, replenish and grow our natural and cultural commons. And when we come to thinking about finance, we're interested in financial tools that help us to invest our wealth so that future generations can live well. And in all these concerns around these kind of key areas of economy, we're interested in the idea of consuming sustainably. So the work of building community economies involves making our interdependencies visible and transparently negotiating just, even if very temporarily just, outcomes that recognise and account for difference and otherness. Our provisional ontology of a community economy is premised on an undoing of any known community of common being. Indeed, the work of building community economies involves the unworking of any assumed collectivity and the continual reperformance of the ethical moment when interdependence is negotiated and its layout provisionally settled. As we've written, the community economy is anything but a blueprint. It's an unmapped and uncertain terrain that calls forth exploratory conversations and political and ethical acts of decision. The feminist imaginary of possibility that has inspired Gibbs and Graham has led us to see the whole world as a stage upon which community economies could be built, and indeed are already being enacted. Ours is a punctiform politics, a vision of disarticulated, place-based movements, of multiple experiments, and no necessarily organised front, of a counter-discourse of economy that marshals these instances into a powerful meshwork. But in the Community Economies Collective, and of course outside it, many questions have been raised about, and here I'm quoting from one of the papers in our special collection written by Ethan Miller, questions have been raised about the near emptiness of a community economy meta-ethic. And doubt has been cast upon its effectiveness as a political strategy for building community economies. And in his paper, Ethan speculates on the reluctance to formulate a set of values to guide organisational strategy for the community economy, and wonders whether there are limits to the analogy between feminist and radical economic movements. The solidarity movement, for example, in comparison, articulates its material and institutional form through a defined set of shared values and an explicit focus on constructing new material conditions of viability for alternative economic practices through concrete connections. And this is a map that I think comes from Maliha's work on mapping the solidarity economy in New York City. And some members of the Community Economies Collective have got a new grant to start to expand this work with others. I think some of them are here in the audience as part of that research work. So, I mean, in comparison to the solidarity economy that has a clear set of values, Ethan raises this question about the emptiness, to some extent, of the community economies conception. And I want to use Ethan's questioning of the limits of a feminist imaginary of possibility as a prompt to begin to develop further a vision of collective action for community economies. And rather than taking up the option of prescribing a set of values for community economies, something that Julie and I were very careful to sidestep, and I think that many of us in the collective don't necessarily advocate. I want to consider how we might still work with constructing new material conditions of viability for community economies in different ways. The engagement of community economy thinking with actor network theory, or material semiotics, has seen a flourishing of research on just this topic. Many researchers in the Community Economies Collective are making an attempt to widen membership of the collective, to dislodge the centrality of human agency, to see actancy as distributed across the hybrid collective or assemblage, and to develop technical devices that increase the viability of community economies. In a recent essay on our new book, Take Back the Economy, geographer Jeff Popke commented that it contained tools for rescuing those economic practices that are threatened with extinction by the calculative rationalities of capitalism. And this phrase, threatened with extinction, struck me at the time. It's taken from Michel Calon's essay, What Does It Mean to Say That Economics is Performative? Calon and others have been working to question the pre-ontological status of the market and the supposition that it operates by causal necessity. Their Latourian-inspired approach to the performativity of economics aligns itself with work that we've done, but in contrast to our focus on promoting the performative effects of new discourses and subjectivities, this work directs attention to the performative materiality of the economy as expressed in technologies, metrics, infrastructures, institutions, and what he calls calculative agencies. Research has focused on the active engineering of socio-technical assemblages, or agencements, that allow markets to perform as they do. In this approach, economic discourse and human subjectivity are but two members of complex socio-technical assemblages that make markets. This doesn't negate, I think, the kind of interventions that Gibson Graham advocates or has made for making other worlds possible, but it is a kind of salutary reminder of what we're up against. The term extinction, I think, is a powerful one because it places non-capitalist economic practices in some kind of shared space with living species, including humans, whose life is threatened, not by representational strategies, but by the impact of human existence as we've come to know it in the Anthropocene. The strong scientific consensus about global warming has catapulted a new matter of concern onto the political landscape, and we are being asked to think about the future as a species, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has written. At the same time, the conviction that humans are located at the centre of political processes of change has been thoroughly shaken by the increasing realisation that we may not be able to control the forces that have been unleashed by 200 years of fossil fuel burning. Species extinctions are accelerating as global warming proceeds unchecked, and climate uncertainty intensifies. For many of us, it's clear that it is time for humans to, in the words of Val Plumwood, find new ways to live with the earth. Ways that will help us to rework ourselves and our high energy, high consumption, and hyper-instrumental societies adaptively. But there's much to suggest that the very materiality of our society stands in the way of such change. One of the criticisms of actor network theory's research into economic performativity is that it contributes to a sense of impossibility. Research in this vein has largely focused on orthodox definitions of markets elaborated by neoclassical economics. By documenting the durability of material semiotic assemblages of capitalist economic relations, the potential emergence of other economies is diminished. And this has been an interesting subject of debate by people like Judith Butler, who's started to think about how her work has been taken up in the economic sphere, and Daniel Miller, who's been quite critical of Michel Calon's work. And in his essay, Calon's essay in our new book, Performing Diverse Economies, he makes an interesting defence of his work, which I think is quite convincing. But rather than going into that, I think we need to reflect on this issue. Clearly, it is a hard ask to both map out the socio-technical assemblages that act to make economies and markets as we know them more real or durable, and at the same time to be open to the performativity of new ways of enacting economy. This tension, I think, is evident in Timothy Mitchell's new book, Carbon Democracy, that documents the fossil fuel-based socio-technical assemblages that have shaped democratic politics over the last century and a half. What we've come to know as organised politics, Mitchell argues, has been intricately connected with and shaped by the socio-technical controversies surrounding coal, oil and uranium. Central to his argument, to Mitchell's argument, is the role of technical expert knowledge of the economy to the way that a politics of oil has shaped our contemporary lives. He writes, innovations in methods of calculation, in the use of money, the measurement of transactions, and the compiling of national statistics made it possible to imagine the central object of politics as an object that could expand without any form of ultimate material constraint. In the 1967-74 crisis, the relations between these disparate elements were all transformed, and he argues they're being transformed again in the present. Today, we see a desperate push to extend the life of fossil fuels by redefining nature as man-made, so as to exploit what's called unconventional oil and gas. So we see the push for the mining of oil shale and extraction through cracking, and the mining of oil sands and coal seam gas via hydraulic fracking. And, as we saw with Jono's hoax, we see fitful breakdowns of the socio-technical assemblages of carbon economy formation. Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is a very interesting book, and it ends at the present. This perilous moment when both our democracies and our undemocracies are unable to act around climate change and global poverty and wealth distribution. To me, or for me, the performative effect of this book, probably wasn't an intended one, is to make a politics of possibility much less real. Yet in the last few pages of his book, Mitchell issues the obligatory call for another world, and in so doing, I think, offers us something to work with. He writes, building solutions to energy future needs is also the building of new forms of collective life. But the form and membership of the collective is up for question. He asks, with what forces, human and non-human, do we want to form alliances? To what powers do we want to subject ourselves? He concludes, the possibility of more democratic futures depends on the political tools with which we address the passing of the era of fossil fuel. Well, these are provocative questions that prompt further thought about how to develop a conception of collective action around community economies in the Anthropocene. In Take Back the Economy, we offer counter-calculative technologies for enacting more than capitalist worlds. As Jeff Poppy noted, we rescue those economic practices that are threatened with extinction by the extinction through the calculative rationalities of capitalism. And we propose a set of other kinds of tools, including all sorts of charts and diagrams depicting diverse economies, as well as checklists, scorecards, ledgers, inventories and yardsticks meant to disentangle and re-envision what we mean by well-being, by surplus, by investment, by supply chains, commons and other dimensions of the economy. These are political tools designed to measure and expose our interdependencies with each other and earth others. In the book, we document examples of actually existing collective actions that attempt to negotiate ethical outcomes around one or more dimensions of interdependence. Our aim is to show that we already have the ethical calculative agency to build new forms of collective life. Of course, these agencies need to be supported and made viable by a vast range of socio-technical devices, policies and laws, infrastructure, scientific know-how, cultural practice, to name just some. So in this last section of the lecture, I want to take up Timothy Mitchell's call for different energy futures and tended to be perceived to gather technical devices that offer new opportunities to act on our interdependence and make community economies more viable. So first, solar citizens. In Australia over the last decade, there's been a rapid uptake by households of photovoltaic solar panels that generate electricity. A series of government programs stimulated this uptake: cash rebates on purchasing and installation of solar panels, renewable energy certificates, and guaranteed tariffs on energy feedback into the grid. During the global financial recession, the Australian Federal Labor Government provided further cash handouts to promote the installation of home insulation that complemented this renewable energy push. In a few years, 1 million solar systems were installed in Australia, a country of 23 million people, and the cost of panels reduced to a quarter of their 2002 price. As the government rebates became increasingly means-tested under criticisms that they are a form of middle-class welfare, the uptake of solar panels in poorer areas has been remarkable. In Sydney, the outer edge municipality of Blacktown, which is one of the poorest and most multicultural areas in the metropolis, is now the solar energy epicenter. With the decline of government subsidies, new mechanisms for accessing solar energy have sprung up. For example, the Californian-based company SunPower offers free installation to Australian households and a financing arrangement with a local credit union that allows for the system to be paid off over 10 years from savings on energy bills and the selling of excess power to the grid. A new political collective has formed around solar power. Solar Citizens is a community project that brings together existing and future solar owners to ensure the rights of solar owners are protected and to see Australia put a panel on every rooftop, as their website says. At one level, it's a small producers movement, a collective of investors in the million rooftop power stations who have put over $8 billion to date of their own money into clean energy generation. They're wary of the big energy companies who don't want to see Australians take back control of their own energy needs, they might. At another level, it's a citizens' movement that protects the right of solar owners and lobbies the government in the face of declining or intermittent support. And most recently, Solar Citizens have mobilised to force the West Australian state government to back down on its decision to slash the feed-in tariff. It's interesting that the identification with solar is something that appears to cross all political allegiances. Solar energy prosumers, producers and consumers, are exercising new calculative agencies that make visible their interdependence with a variety of human and non-human others. With the sun and its daily and seasonal rhythms, the technologies of solar capture and their financing, with the national energy grid and its demands and pricing fluctuations, and with their household energy use. In a reality TV program, The Carbon Cops, which was broadcast on public TV in 2007, a sample of households were issued with energy monitors to measure their consumption in real time. The average Australian household emits 14 tonnes of carbon emissions per year, and all the households selected were very far over this figure. So they helped the household to monitor where were their carbon emissions largely coming from. They installed these little monitors that showed green when the household's usage was within the national average of carbon emissions and turned shades of red when it exceeded this amount. And households were challenged to reduce their carbon footprint to at least or below the national average. And they were then helped to make their homes more energy efficient and their practices less wasteful. Over the 6-week period of the program, they tried changing their behaviour under the watchful eye of the camera. And this process is being replicated all over Australia as new habits are being learnt and new calculative abilities developed. From the perspective of community economy concerns, we can see the current and future well-being of the planet being put into the same calculative frame as the well-being of households. Secondly, solar cooperatives. In the context of the declining manufacturing and heavy industry employment in Australia, a group of unionists has embarked on a very different kind of production experiment linked to the renewable sector. They formed the Earthworker Cooperative, Australia's first workers' cooperative for green manufacturing. Inspired by the worker cooperative movement in the US, this is the first contemporary attempt by the Australian labour movement to challenge private ownership and establish cooperatively owned businesses. The plan is to build union-supported, worker-owned and controlled cooperatives, manufacturing solar hot water units and ultimately the full range of green technologies. And here we see a very promising initiative coming from the labour movement, which for so long has fought for membership benefits with very little regard to the long term. The business model for this venture includes an interesting marketing and distribution strategy that combines diverse economic practices. Solar hot water systems will be included as an in-kind wage payment in negotiations between unions and employers as part of enterprise bargaining agreements. And as they write on their website, this facilitates the collective purchase of goods by workers, enabling them to start bringing their cost of living down by the use of solar power, cutting carbon emissions and supporting Australian manufacturing jobs that never leave our shores. The Earthworker Initiative enrolls a worker-owned cooperative business model that ensures democratic discussion of how surplus will be distributed. And we could start to record the kind of decisions that are being made on a kind of people's account of enterprise. And this is an example from our book, which is doing it for a different cooperative, not the one I'm talking about. Some of these distributions of surplus will flow to unions and employers as an incentive for opening their enterprise bargaining agreements in a way which provides a better-than-cash arrangement to workers. Some surplus will flow back to the cooperative to invest in more work and research that funds research and development. And 5% will go towards social justice projects, including to assist low-income families and older citizens to install solar hot water systems in partnership with the Uniting Church. The Earthworker experiment is fashioning socio-technical assemblages that are making community economies more viable.